I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while each branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given to you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go out and bear fruit, fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. May God bless the reading of his word.
We're going to look at John 15. One of the most amazing things about John 15 is really this idea of what God desires for his believers. Now, remember I gave a series of message on John 17, which is sort of the end of that last discourse of Jesus. People have always put 13 through 17 as the upper room. It's hard to get a vineyard in that upper room. So probably chapter 15, they've left the upper room and are now traveling through that little valley, the Kidron Valley, over to what will eventually be the Mount of Olives, doing all of those. So they went over there. But on the way, he gave this great discourse to his disciples. Now, you remember in John 13 and in 14 when Jesus is talking there, and he's telling them that of all the baptism issues that he does in washing the feet of the disciples, what is the one thing he says to Peter when Peter goes, well, don't wash my feet, let me do yours? And Jesus goes, no, if I don't wash you, you have no part of me. So Peter goes, hey, everything, give me a full bath. And what did Jesus say? He said, you don't need a bath. Y'all are clean, but one. We'll leave that one later. And he says, so you just need foot washing. So he's telling his disciples that they're already believers. He's not telling them, you better not doubt. You better be doing the right things. He's telling them, you are already clean. Okay. Then he does the Lord's Supper. Of all the accounts of the Lord's Supper, he spends a disordinate amount of time on one particular occasion. You remember what that was? He says, the one who's going to betray me, he's kind of saying, I give you a chance. Here's a chance not to do this. So he gives it there because the purpose of John's gospel is to bring people to saving faith. In John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, it says, many other signs did Jesus do in the presence of his disciples, but these are written so that you, the reader, might believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that by believing in him you have life in his name. That's the purpose of the whole book. So people have always asked, how is it that this occasion in that upper room talking to just disciples, does it fit the message of giving life? That's what I said. He told it in the washing of the feet. They're all clean. How did they get clean? By believing in him. Okay, he says the same thing about the Lord's Supper. He says, one of you, all of you are clean but one. I'll give you another chance here. So in 15, he continues on this same thing about telling people that they have a way to abide. I like the word abide because it's the same word that John will use in 1 John. The idea of being vitally connected is the idea of remaining. And he tells them here that if you want to be effective, you got to stay close to me. He wasn't saying, here's how you're going to prove you're really close to me. If Jesus was going to say anything about how you could show your love for Jesus, what would it be? You may even remember in 1 John. I do interactive, sorry. Broadcast or not. Huh? Love one another. He didn't say, if you're not this close, do the right things, do the right things, do the right things, you're gone. He's saying if he wanted to show a test of how you're a real disciple. Remember, disciple is not the same word for believer. Disciple means you choose to follow. Believing is you put your faith in him. You receive everlasting life. So what we find here in this passage here, he's going along and this vineyard is there and he tells them here that this is how you need to remain and teach and how we follow him to be effective. Now, I just want to show you a picture of my last group that I was in Amman, Jordan. I teach in the Middle East, as you may have heard. For the last 12 years, I've been an adjunct professor at the seminary there. I teach master's and doctoral level courses for them there. But these are my students. This was a course I taught for the whole month of July in Amman, Jordan. And this was outside in the courtyard of the school, and it's a tower that they use for prayer and other things there. Beautifully laid out campus. The founder of the seminary was a classmate of mine. We graduated from Dallas Seminary the same time, and we've been friends for now over 40 years. Just great, great friends there. But these students came from Iraq, from Egypt, from Syria, from Sudan, South Sudan. And this time I had a student from Eritrea, which is just above Ethiopia on what we call the eastern coast of Africa. And which is interesting because I had an Eritrean student at the school where I was president for 17 years, and he was from Eritrea and pastors an Eritrean church in Denver area. This is a photo of my wife and I up by the border of Syria, Jordan, and Israel, up in the upper west, northwest corner, up there in a place called Kadesh, which is also called Gadara in the scriptures. A great site. They're just discovering and uncovering those places, and we just had a great time there. If it was a little bit clearer, not as hazy, you could see the Sea of Galilee up there. Very much a wonderful sight there. Okay, so we want to talk about John 15. Remember, Jesus said that he is life. When you go to the prologue of the Gospel of John, it's an interesting beginning there in the Gospel of John. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, you ever stop to think what that said? It seems odd. I have to tell you, read that. Now, I believe John's purpose of doing these things and not telling us all the story yet. He doesn't tell us the name of this person until about verse 16. He tells us that he's the Word, God, Creator, life, light. And just in case you're thinking it's not John the Baptist, puts that right in there. Then he goes on, without him, nothing could have been created that was created. Went all the way through that. And it isn't until around verse 16, but grace and truth comes through Jesus Christ. He's wanting the reader to be drawn in and ask those questions. So when we share the message of life with people, the Gospel of John is an easy one to use. But don't answer all the questions up front. In the beginning was the Word, that's Jesus. And the Word, that's Jesus. And just let them ask questions and draw it in, because that's what John designed the Gospel of John for that purpose. So now in verse 15, he is midway through, if you will, this discourse with his disciples. After chapter 17, he will be arrested and then tried and then crucified and raised from the dead. All those things will occur. But this is the last time with those that were his disciples. These are the ones he poured his life into. Now, what was the main concern of all of these 11 now disciples, because one's already gone? What's the main question they keep having over and over with Jesus? Do you remember? Who's going to be first in the kingdom? Me? Can you imagine you're sitting there, you're James and John, and your mom walks in and goes, "Excuse me, Jesus, which one of my boys is going to be number one, number two?" And we're sitting there going, "Mom, don't do that." But that was their concern. They were just like every one of us, somewhat not quite getting the point sometimes. But Jesus wanted these disciples to know, and he wanted them to know in this great passage here of John 15 about the wonder of being connected to him to be useful. You ever notice that in James 2 it says, faith without works is dead, right? Did it ever say faith without works means that faith never existed? All things that are dead have one thing in common. What is that? Besides being dead. Don't give me the obvious. They were all once alive. It didn't say, my father died in 2001. It doesn't mean he never existed. I have all the memories to prove it, good and bad. But he's telling them here, he says, this is how you're going to be useful. He didn't say, by the way, this, you do this, you're not mine. You do this, you're mine. Back and forth. I don't know if I shared before, but when I was in the Navy, we were off the coast, off the, what we call Westpac, off the line, and my friend says, "Lewis, you need to get this eternal security thing answered." So he took me aside. It was in 1971, and it was hot on the carrier, and he took me to some part, and he said, "You need to know if you have everlasting life or not." And he went to the great assurance passages, particularly of 1 John. If you have the Son, you have life. All these things, on and on and on it went. From that point on, I never had doubts about my connection and my relationship and having the free gift of everlasting life. But the whole idea is that he wants to tell them here is how you can stay so connected that when you pray, you're going to pray exactly what my will is. Not, there's a famous song, "Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz?" Her life did not end well either. But this idea here is you want to stay spiritually connected and produce fruit. So he's going to tell us these things along the way. So turn your Bibles to John 15, and we're going to look at that a little bit more in depth, and we're going to go through it. So he said I have till like 1:30. Just kidding. So, but the idea here is that all the way through, he says, I am the true vine and my Father is the vine dresser. A wonderful understanding of that relationship. So, who is the source of life in that verse? Jesus himself. Who's the one that does the vine dressing? This is called viticulture in our world today. A friend of mine, Dr. Gary Derrickson, wrote probably the best paper on this from viticulture. Who knew there'd be such a word? But he took care, he did his work at A&M, Texas A&M, in the area of agriculture. But we did a THM together, and all the rest of those are history. But he says, my Father's the vine dresser. He's the one that does all these things. Okay. Now, verse 2, what they discovered really was this idea that what God has in mind, he says, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, the word is eros, which means to take away. It means to take away. That same word erios, is used in other places along the way, and it tells us here that it means when the stone was rolled away, it wasn't cut off. When he told the man who was healed to take up his mat and walk, he didn't say, cut off the mat. He says, remove it. So it really came from a document that said that when and there's a work order that was found. So the way they did viticulture then was different than the way we do it today. Maybe we do it better today in some ways, and not the way they did it in Israel today. It's the way in which they did it in that first century. And it was that they would, after they plant the sticks, which look like sticks when you start a vineyard, looks like, have you ever been there when they've taken all the harvest away? It looks like they're growing really cheap wood. Until spring. In spring, something happens to that just gnarly piece of stuff that's left and trimmed back. They begin to see the branches begin to grow. Then as they begin to grow, they know that the one thing that hurts grapes always is mold. Now, I know that after a while when we harvest those, and it takes through a process, it does turn to mold, but also makes a sweet wine. But when they're on the ground, it ruins it. So what they do is they take those branches now that they begin to bear, they begin to grow, and he trellises them up off the ground, removes them, takes them away from the ground so that they might be safe. But the parts that they begin to show sprigs, they would trim those off, we call thinning, so that the remaining sprigs would be better, bigger fruit. That just seems to be, hey, I'm not a farmer, but I eat those things. But the whole idea there, he's telling us this is what he wants us to do, is to be able to. Now, they also found in this document that in the fall, after all the harvest is done, they cut and they chop everything down. All the grapes have been harvested. All that's left is just dying branches. He takes them all and they cut them way back and they burn them. Why would they burn old branches? So there's no disease going into the next plant or the next harvest that would come about the next year. So he goes on and tells them here, he says, so every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, he trellises that. Now, if that next sentence would have introduced but to those, it would have been a contrast between something that's bad and something that's good. But he just continues on with an and says that he takes it away and he does this extra part. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes so it'll even bear more. So both parts are good things, not one bad, one good. There's no contrast there. So all the way through, you are already clean. Y'all, second person plural, y'all are already clean. So he's not saying, check yourself, make sure you're still the right believer, you're really a believer. Some faiths today die the death of 1,000 introspections. I wonder if I'm really saved. I wonder if I'm really saved. I wonder if I'm doing all the right things. I wonder if there's enough of those right things to prove that I'm really his. And that was my life before 1971, in a real rudimentary, young, immature sailor way. But it still was true. Jesus is giving these disciples here this idea that he wants them to understand that the vine dresser is going to take care of it. The vine is there, the branches, how they relate all the way through. Okay, but he wants us to have a spiritually fruitful life, a Christ-like life that draws other people to him. You want to be attractive about it. Have you ever met Christians that are obnoxious? Chuck Colson was saying when he started prison ministry, he went to a prison. There was this one guy. He was just, everybody disliked this guy, and he came up to Chuck Colson and says, I'm a believer. And Chuck goes, please don't tell anybody. I mean, it was horrible the way this guy was. And Chuck Colson has a way to cut through those things. One of the things that he and Chuck Swindoll had in common, they'd both been Marines. And so at his inauguration, Chuck Colson gave a great speech about things that only Marines can say about Marines. So it's a great discourse to see those two there. But this idea here, and he wants us to bear fruit. That's what he wants us to have along the way. Okay. And then we want to get in the vine. This union with him is what he gives us when we now are believers. 1 John, it'll say in chapter 2, we should abide in such a way that when he returns, we can stand in boldness and not shrink back. How many have worked in Awana? The rest of you, shame on you. Gotta tell you. Awana stood for, used to, approved workmen are not ashamed. Where would people be ashamed? At the judgment seat. You don't want to stand before Christ and be ashamed of the way you did what he's given you to do. That's the great part about a relationship with him. So abide in such a way so when he returns we can stand with boldness and not ashamed, which same thing in the Timothy passage of Awana. So he wants us to, we're already sealed with him. He says you all are clean, you're all mine. And he wasn't giving them a mind game to tease them to make sure they keep contemplating the right things. So this idea of cooperating with the vine dresser, he takes this way, the spring, and he says, but also he goes on and says, verse 5, I am the vine and you're the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without him we can do nothing. So without him, he's saying we are useless. That's the difference, useless in that area. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out. What's the next word after cast out? Like or as, depending on your translation. What does that tell us? It's a simile. It's not saying you are that branch and burn you up. Okay. But he's saying like a branch would be burned. Why is it burned? Because it's now useless. He goes on from that and he says, out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them away into the fire, and they are burned, or they are consumed. Okay. If this was the lake of fire, is anyone in the lake of fire when they are in there later on? Are they ever consumed? No. It just goes on and on and on and on. Well, where are things consumed like wood, hay, and stubble? According to Paul's teaching, where is that done? At the judgment seat of Christ. But he still says, you know, it's kind of like after all that, he says, if all that you have is wood and stubble and it's consumed, it's like, Paul goes on to say, but you're saved as through by fire. It's kind of like, whew, glad I got through that. But you have no rewardable part of your life. But you're still saved. You're still his. So when people use this idea, well, you're put into the fire and you're burned up. It can't be the lake of fire. Nobody is ever consumed in a lake of fire. That's the terrible part. It just keeps on going and going and going. But he tells them here, so the same thing in the viticulture, the things they found, is that at the end of the harvest, they come all up, they burn them all up, and they're consumed. It's just a very vivid picture of uselessness. It's just nothing left, as is the wood, hay, and stubble in Paul's teachings as well. So it's after the harvest. One is done in the spring, one is done after the harvest. Now, here's the thing. After the harvest, how do you know which branches bore fruit during the harvest? You don't leave a note, I took a fruit from this, I took a grape from this spot, took a grape from this spot. There's nothing left. So all of us will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. We'll all be held accountable for what he has entrusted to us to do. But it's not where someone goes, you know, on that day you were not his, and so on and so forth. But he says, and if you abide in me, if you stay connected, if you want to be useful, you have to stay connected. It doesn't mean connected with everlasting life. It means be useful to him. That's what God is asking all of us to do and all that he gives us to do in this way. This idea of, I've given you examples there of bearing more fruit. That's what he does. And he tells us here, and even in John 11, with the issue of when he was with Mary and Martha and their brother had died, and he's going to bring this man who is now dead back, restored to life. What does he tell to be done to that stone? Let it be removed. It didn't mean take it off. It just means get it out of the way. Same word is used there of arrow along the way. And Jesus raised his eyes. Didn't mean he removed his eyes. I mean, he raised it up. So this idea all the way through, the way in which it's used is that way. Then he tells us here we can bear fruit, cooperate with the vine dresser. Cooperate with what God has given us to do. He prunes us to do that. Pruning is never easy. I had a professor once, David Needham, and he says, think of the believer as a flawless, decolored diamond in the rough. I mean, but what makes it brilliant when they put facets on it? Now, it would be nice if they could just massage that in there, but how are the facets made? With a chisel and a grinder and then a polisher and so on. Now, that's an amazing thing. That's what he does to believers. He says, I want you to be used of me so that what you already possess can now be useful for the rest of it. And once that usefulness is there, it's amazing what will happen to us. Just like that diamond. You know, you look at it and you go, wow, all the different facets on that make it brilliant. I used to work for a diamond broker. Don't ask me why. It was to pay the bills. And they said, one thing we were told, this was in the 80s, never ever tell somebody that a diamond is an investment. You like it because it's pretty. You like it because it does what you want it to do. Because everything fluctuates. But it's just in the eye of the beholder. And most of us cannot see without the aid of a loupe or a microscope all the, never use the word flaws, always use characteristic of a diamond. All of us are that same way. We have characteristics as believers. So it is when we are attached to what he wants us to do. Then he tells us this ongoing dependence on Jesus has to be there. When we do it on our own strength, we are doing it because we want our own praise. And it doesn't always end up well for where God would want us to be. Prayerfully effectively, when we are informed in harmony with his words. The more you know God's words, the more you know how to pray his words. Did you ever think that prayer is not giving God information that if we didn't tell him, he wouldn't know? I'm not going to pray that. He heard me say that, I'm in trouble. He's like, are you kidding me? Have you ever had children come to you and they go, I have to confess, and we're all going, we know. But we don't say that. We want, because it's building them. That's what God is doing with us. He desires that we, in this relationship, continue on in doing these things, that we bear much fruit all the way through these things. And we want to experience this trust in the way we follow his directions. You don't know, people say, if he would just tell me what I need to do. You know, if God would just reveal to me his direction. I'm going, he's already given it to us. Now, when you know this completely, he might tell you something new, but not too many of us know this completely. So he's always saying, go back to the Word, go back to the Word. Get into it. Get into the place. You know how God is preparing us to do these things as well. That we do. He wants us to keep what he's given to us in obedience there. Then he wants us to build a reciprocal relationship with other believers. Remember I said the one thing he would ask of all believers is they love each other. Wow. And the way you show you're my disciples is to have love for one another. I love you, love you, Lord, love you, Lord. Shut up. I love you, Lord, I love you, Lord. It's not what God is looking for. He's looking for, how can I love my brother and sister in Christ? Does that mean you let them do the stupid things they keep doing? Thankfully, other brothers and sisters have tried to stop me from doing stupid things. Didn't always work. But he says that's what he desires of us in this relationship. We need each other. It's a cooperation that we cannot have outside of that relationship with him. But if we want to show that we're really his disciples, stay connected to him in such a way that we now have a connection with one another. Persecution has not come to every part of our planet today yet. What will we do when it does? How we help each other? How we get through these things? How are we going to lift each other up? Well, it's like most people have the idea, If a bear's coming after you, you don't have to be the fastest. You just have to outrun one. That's how most people look at life today. As long as I beat somebody, as long as I get ahead. That's not what Jesus is looking for. He's looking for a way in which we can be that disciple that so well knows what he's about that we can give up our own self-interest for the help of other people. So what part of this passage arrested our attention, and how will we respond to it? That's really what he's asking. How are we going to do it? Personally, obviously personally. Cooperatively, absolutely. Will everyone know? Not necessarily. Have you ever done something good for somebody else and not tell them? That's hard to do. I didn't tell them. I hope somebody else tells them what I did anyway. I want to be able to go, oh, no, that's okay. There was this one young man, he preached, and he got back to the back, waiting for the people as they were leaving, and this people came by, thank you, Pastor, great sermon. Oh, thank you. It wasn't me, it was Jesus. So finally this older lady came up, and he goes, no, it wasn't me, it wasn't Jesus. It was Jesus. She goes, it wasn't that good. So we have to know our limits. But the whole idea of abiding is a great work, not of terror, but of solace and commitment. That's a great thing for us to learn. And in our world, we become less and less relevant to what the world thinks. Too bad. We're about the Savior's business. We're about what he desires. But we don't know what he desires unless we're in there, in his word. And that's really what we need to be about. John 15 is a great place. Like I said, my friend wrote a great article on it because it just needs to be understood. It wasn't a terror. It's kind of like Hebrews 10, 26 through 31. Hebrews 10, 26 says, if we continue sinning after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. Ta-da! But, verse 27 begins. If you go back to verse 18, which I encourage you to do in that same chapter 10 of Hebrews, you'll find out it says, for Christ died for all, once for all, therefore there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. Notice I said that very pleasantly, but that's the way it should be read in verse 26 as well. It's not a caution, it's a statement that if we are in him, we have life. And there's a sense of, he's done it. But then verse 27 says, but if you think you're going to get away with these sinning thing, you're out of your mind. Because he tells us all that sin looks like from God's perspective. It's like you trampled on the very blood and body of Christ. It was just a sin. It's not that big. That's what God is looking for, to understand our security, stand firm in it, but look at sin honestly and look at following him earnestly in all that we do.